show. We have an incredible guest today, but first, apologies for the Bum Fardo episode. I know Sean's mic was a little wonky. We definitely fixed that for the next few episodes, but hopefully you guys were still able to enjoy that and the amazing Bum Fardo sort of drill beat that our audio producer Dale cooked up, because it's actually, I've had it stuck in my head. It's actually quite good. But our guest today is Jake Adelstein, not Steen. He corrected me on that. He is the author of Tokyo Vice. We've talked about it a lot. I think we actually interviewed him in one of our earliest bonus episodes. You know, if you guys have seen the TV show, it's about his life. He also wrote a book called The Last Yakuza that came out last year. And he's like the foremost expert, I would say, on the Yakuza in the English-speaking world. He was the first, I think, Western crime reporter for a Japanese newspaper ever. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm like 95% on that. And he has a new book coming out called Tokyo Noir, In and Out of Japan's Underworld. So definitely pick that up. And he's just a fascinating guy with a ton of stories. So enjoy this interview and let us know what you think. We are joined today by Jake Adelstein, who is the author of Tokyo Vice, The Last Yakuza, and coming out now is Tokyo Noir, which I had the pleasure of reading last week, and also the show Tokyo Vice, which I was a huge fan of, and I think a lot of people were. Sad to see that it's not coming back for a season 3, even though I think it was only supposed to be 2 seasons. Is there anything else in the works, TV or movie-wise for you?
You know, there is another thing I'm working on, but it's in such a fledgling state it is about a real FBI undercover operation where a guy sort of went undercover with the Yakuza, the only time that's ever been done. So that's in the development stages. I'm going to, in my impromptu book tour, I'm going to Los Angeles to sit down with one of the writers and producers to talk about it. So we might have something coming along down the pipeline. Maybe it'll be called Hawaii Vice. I'm not sure. But
yeah, I mean, that kind of gives us a little bit of a hint of what it's about. After, you know, the last book you talked about that sort of diming out of all those Yakuzas in Hawaii by Goto. And
yeah.
So I mentioned to a friend that I was interviewing you, and he told me to ask about Megan Thee Stallion, who recently just had a big Japanese rap crossover and is apparently a huge fan of yours and Tokyo Vice.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Megan Thee Stallion. As a matter of fact, I picked up the recent issue of Women's Health with her on the cover because I am such a fan. Genesis of that and of us actually chatting briefly on Instagram is that Sho, who plays the character Sato on the TV show, was cast in her latest music video. And the person who cast him, Ko Iwagami, is a really young, great casting director and someone that I pulled into Tokyo Vice as a casting director because I really liked his work. So we had this kind of nice back and forth, and I was sort of joking about it on Instagram, and I did not expect that Megan Thee Stallion would actually reply, but that was very nice. If there is a world in which Tokyo Vice Season 3 happens on another network, a possibility that seems slim, you can bet that we'll find some way to write a cameo for her into the show. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. So the book Tokyo Noir, which I just read, I think is coming out within the month or relatively soon.
October 1st.
October 1st. It picks up sort of right after Tokyo Vice in terms of storytelling, though. It's kind of like, you know, you're writing Tokyo Vice, I think, while you're working on the stuff in this book. What's going on in your life in Tokyo at the time of the start of Tokyo Noir?
At the time of Tokyo Noir, like I had just been finishing work for the U.S. State Department on a study of human trafficking in Japan, and going over the rough draft of that. I was writing Tokyo Vice, and I basically got asked by one or two investment banks if I would help them clean up their portfolio because several, firms outside of Japan and firms within Japan had been doing business with Yakuza front companies, a front company being a firm that is either controlled directly by the Yakuza or is financed by them, and is often doing illegal activities or activities in which they're making profits by doing things that a normal company wouldn't do. And so I became sort of, instead of going back to journalism, I became a sort of corporate private eye. And I would get, sometimes 2 or 3 cases a week, mostly from these investment banks. And they would say to me, like, we've got this firm that we've invested money in, or we're going to invest money in. We want you to tell us how bad they are. I mean, by the time they get to me, it's not a question of whether they're bad. It's, are they so bad that we can't do business with them? Should we cut ties with them? If we don't cut ties with them, will the financial services agency take away our private banking license like they basically did to Citibank? And that was an exciting time, because it's like, being an investigative journalist, except instead of writing for 1 million people, you're writing for about 3 people: your boss, his boss, and maybe one other person. And, that was kind of exciting for me. You've worked for Vice News. We were just talking about this. You know what it's like to sort of be in the news cycle where you're caught up in what is the day-to-day news, and you never really stick around for one thing, and you have these crazy deadlines and you got them in. And it was kind of like the same thing, except I had more flexibility with the deadlines, and I was getting paid a lot more per article per se than I was ever getting as a journalist. So I definitely enjoyed the work.
Yeah, I mean, I've known some people who've gone that route, and I've looked into it as well. But I think you're one of the few people I know who've actually make it sound relatively exciting, and that's because I don't think most people doing corporate due diligence have to deal with like meeting with former Yakuza guys or current Yakuza guys and trying to figure out whether this company works for it. So I think you should commend yourself on that. Not many people can make corporate due diligence actually exciting to read about.
Well, there was this, wow, I sound like I'm nostalgic about this. There was this golden age where, the Yamaguchi Gumi and Inagawa Kai and all these companies realized that the Japanese stock market was, very poor at doing background checks on companies, and that it was possible to take a company and get a backdoor listing, get people to buy the shares in an IPO and pocket a lot of money. And then using one of your other front companies, you could start shorting the company before you revealed the fact that actually this company that everyone had been investing in was owned by the Yakuza, which would cause it to crash down. So it was like this perfect virtuous circle of making money hand over fist, both with the IPO and both as the company crashed, which is kind of a crazy way to do business. Some of these guys who are smart would actually funnel money into these companies, kind of like venture capitalists, and then realize like, wow, the company that we've created as a lark is actually doing really well. So why don't we just move to the shadows and make sure we get a cut of all the profits in the future, and we'll just let it go. Those were the smart guys, but that's kind of boring, right? To actually look after a company and, worry about whether it's doing well and its stock prices and its products. It's a lot easier to just pump and dump, especially if you can make money both ways. So, it was interesting times. And I was just going over sort of like the flow chart of how to do one of these investigations. And some of the stuff I was thinking back, yeah, you wouldn't know how to do this, or you wouldn't know to look for unless you've done a lot of these or spent a lot of time looking at organized crime front companies.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're describing it is the company's actually working out, like that irony. It kind of reminds me of these, I used to know these kids who did like, this is back 2015, drug dealing with like Bitcoin, where scams using Bitcoin. But it turns out if they would just have held on to the Bitcoin instead of using it to do business back and forth, they'd probably be a lot wealthier right now than they were just selling drugs and things like that.
I wrote a book on Bitcoin that's coming out in next year, finally in English. And in the process of writing that book, which is mostly about the collapse of Mt. Gox in Japan, which was once the world's largest Bitcoin exchange, I bought one Bitcoin as kind of experiment to see how it would be done. And then years later, when Mt. Gox, without going into this whole stuff, Mt. Gox, this Bitcoin exchange that went bankrupt, but had Bitcoins so that it actually became financially solvent and worth hundreds of millions of dollars. When it actually suddenly had a huge amount of money because the price of Bitcoins went up, someone called me to say, like, I want to get a hold of the founder. And I realized, like, wait, I have one Bitcoin. Like, I have a Bitcoin. I cashed it out for like $25,000. And that was my daughter's, first year of college education and more. So I see the irony in that. There's the irony of is that I probably made more on having the Bitcoin that I bought for research to write that book than I'll ever make from the book itself.
Yeah, that's what being a journalist is basically. But actually, that's interesting. I was wondering, you wrote in Tokyo Noir that it was your third book in English, and you had written four, and I assumed that that's the fourth book. I had no idea. What's one good salacious detail from that book that we might not know?
Okay, from the I sold myself for Bitcoins. One of the salacious details is that the Japanese government had arrested Mark Karpeles, who was the world's biggest running the world's biggest Bitcoin exchange, because they had believed that he had stolen $500 million worth of Bitcoins. And so when the IRS and the Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, were looking for the real criminal who had ripped off a bunch of Bitcoin exchanges, they went to the Japanese police and said, can we have the database for Mt. Gox so that we can catch the real guy? And the Japanese police didn't want to give them the data because they'd arrested the wrong person and it would just make them look bad. So I ended up having dinner with the special agent who was running that case, which was Tigran Gambarian, who is known as the blockchain wizard, because he was one of the first guys to figure out how to trace Bitcoin on the blockchain. And basically, over beer and takoyaki at a izakaya in Tokyo, we made a deal. I was like, okay, if you arrest the actual criminal, then you give me a heads up and you make sure to write in the press release the person responsible is this guy, not Mark Karpeles, because he appears to be innocent and he shouldn't go to jail. And I will get the database from Mark or his lawyer, and I will take it to you in San Francisco, which is exactly what I did, which was a weird moment of going from reporter of a story to being involved in the story. I never thought that I would be working on this story and end up taking the Mt. Gox database to the feds. So that is a weird thing that's in the book. What is even weirder is that Tigran Gambarian later went on to leave the IRS, where he was a great special agent. Was working for Binance. This year in February, he went to visit Nigeria, which has been having some issues with Binance, and they basically arrested him and have been holding him hostage in an order to extort money out of Binance, his company. So I have been writing about Tigran and his family and trying to get interest in people to get him out of prison from Nigeria, this wonderful, crazy special agent, partly because he was such a help in writing my book, and partly because, he has always kept his word to me. So that's a crazy story. You don't think that, you're going to be reuniting with your buddy because he's being held hostage in Nigeria.
Yeah,
that's my weird story from there.
Sounds deeply unpleasant. Nigerian jails or prisons or whatever it is. I don't think they sound too fun.
No,
probably
really
worse
awful.
than Japan. Yeah, and
Japanese prisons are horrible, but I think Japanese prisons don't even have air conditioning in some prisons. So maybe Nigerian prisons are a step above if you're in the right one.
Another thing that another salacious detail you mentioned in Tokyo Noir was this story of this $350 million Lehman swindle by a guy named Action, and you hint there's a big book tell-all coming out this year. Has it come out? Is that public knowledge yet?
No, his book is behind track. But what and also because he's a good friend, I'm not going to step on his story too much. But Lehman Brothers Japan got swindled out of $350 million before Lehman Brothers itself went under, and in the process of doing that swindle, Lehman Brothers was led to believe that Marubeni, which is one of Japan's most esteemed trading houses, was backing the deal. And they had meetings at the Marubeni offices with actors pretending to be Marubeni executives. So when the time came to collect their payment on this, this business loan that they had been doing, and no money came, and they went to Marubeni headquarters and demanded to see Department Chief Sato. The Sato that came out wasn't the Sato they had been meeting because they'd been meeting with an actor. It was such a crazy, well-planned scheme. And it was fascinating working on that, as part of a due diligence. But Action, has all the details, so I'm not going to spoil it for you. But it was kind of crazy. And one of the reasons that, that Lehman Brothers got screwed so bad is that a lawyer who used to work at several Godot front companies had been hired by Lehman Brothers Japan a couple months prior to this huge ripoff. And so I kind of knew what was coming. And we sort of warned Lehman Brothers as professional courtesy, but they clearly didn't pay attention.
That's a very old school sort of flim flam right there. Just pretend to be this company that you're not. You'd expect them to do a little bit more due diligence, but if you are imagine you think you're doing a business deal with Microsoft, you can't lose. Microsoft has got our back on this. And you go to the Microsoft offices, right? You're in the Microsoft offices and you're meeting in a boardroom with someone, who claims to be an employee of the company. You can see how people would fall for that. Yeah, for sure. Especially, if it's a foreign country you don't know super well. But yeah, good for, well, not good for them, but that's $350 million is a lot of money to lose on a thing like that. Another element of the book, I think that's throughout it, moving away from corporate due diligence, is your sort of back and forth relationship with Goto. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yeah, you pronounced it great.
Almost top Yakuza boss, who was your nemesis in the first book in Tokyo Vice. He threatens you again when the book is published, and there's this kind of great, crazy back and forth. Where is he right now? I know he became a Buddhist priest. He was in Cambodia. Do you have any idea what's going on with his life at the moment?
Well, he's in and out of Cambodia. As mentioned in the book, in 2015, the United States put him on the OFAC list. He's a persona non grata. You can't do business with him if you're a United States citizen, because he has, the Department of Treasury says this, created a criminal empire in Cambodia, which now has become a huge center of cyber scams and telephone frauds. I think the United States Department Trafficking in Persons report this year has a long section on how some Cambodian powerful tycoons are involved in basically holding people hostage to set up the kind of scams where you are sold cryptocurrency over the phone or through emails. So he's still in and out of Cambodia. The last I heard of Goto was that he was not in very good health and that he is slightly senile. I kind of like to keep tabs on the guy just to know what he's up to.
Yeah, I would do that too if there was someone like that out there who had threatened to kill me multiple times.
Yeah, I don't think that we have a very cordial relationship. I was doing a documentary for a French TV company, and there's this famous Japanese fixer who we interviewed. And while we were interviewing him, he said many unpleasant things about Goto. And I was thinking, should we include this in the documentary or not? Because maybe I don't want to, what is the word? As the Japanese phrase is, you don't want to touch the scales of the dragon.
Instigate.
But yeah. I like to touch the scales of the dragon. You don't want to wake this with a sleeping dog or something like that.
Yeah. I have to assume you've made the offer for an interview before, but now that he's getting old and senile, a lot of these guys kind of live that kind of life towards the end of their days. I guess he's already written an autobiography, but maybe he wants to just have it out. Has there been any attempt recently to do a little one-on-one Jake and Goto, just kind of get it going for a couple days?
So many questions I'd like to ask him, but I don't know if I would be particularly civil. He's a guy who has proven that you can be untouchable in Japan. His goons killed a real estate developer in 2006, and the Japanese police never charged him for it or arrested him. It was never prosecuted. But the family sued him in civil court, and they were awarded $1.5 million, and he apologized to the family, for my men, killing your dad. I'm so sorry about it. Those hot-headed kids of mine. I've read his autobiography, and he doesn't seem to have any remorse. Most of these guys, when they write one of these autobiographies, especially a guy who's supposedly become a Buddhist priest, you would expect some expression of remorse, but there is none. I mean, I guess that makes it for an interesting read because he doesn't hold back anything.
Yeah, I think that makes it more interesting than the guys with remorse, because they're always trying to excuse their actions or whatever else. In terms of just observing their story, not being a part of it like you are, but in terms of just like being an outside observer, I always like those sort of books when they're a little more unrelenting in terms of exposing what they've done or who they are as a person. And it kind of seems like he was like that. Or
yeah,
he is like that.
He refuses to discuss the FBI deal he made. That's that in the book. He's like, yeah, I can't discuss that. It's a glomar. I cannot confirm or deny the existence of this deal that I made because it would get a lot of people in trouble. So I'm not going to say anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting too, right? I think you mentioned there were a couple of Yakuza. I don't know if that's a new phenomenon or them kind of writing these autobiographies when they quote unquote require. In America, obviously, it's very big with these former mob guys starting podcasts. Are there any Yakuza podcasts out there right now or any coming?
There is a guy that I like quite a lot. What else is his name? Takegaki Satoru-san, who used to be in the Yamaguchi-gumi, the head of the Tanaka, the fourth generation leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi, Takenaka. Yeah, he was an organization leader in the Takenaka Gumi. And he now has a podcast. He's written several books. He retired from the Yakuza, I think around 2011 or 2015. He's been out for many years. So he has a podcast where he talks about the good old days and the bad old days and the decline of the Yakuza and why they don't deserve, why it's okay that they're being crushed out of existence. So he is and then there's one guy named Choaki Taro, he's a very self-effacing guy because as a Yakuza, he spent most of his life in prison. So he has a podcast, which is very funny, where he talks about news that's happening in the Yakuza world and his own misadventures as a kind of goofy, bumbling Yakuza. So those are the two that are the most entertaining. And Choaki Taro, which is like, I guess, kind of almost like prison loser Yakuza. He's very funny. And he did there's a very long episode where he explains all the various Yakuza slang, which in itself is probably one of the most entertaining hours I've ever listened to a podcast / YouTube thing. Most of them are YouTubers as well as podcast guys. I think the Japanese language doesn't lend itself to podcasts very well because there's so many homonyms. It really helps to have a screen where you have the words on the screen so that you can be sure that that you've got the right word in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing too. And I don't know if you pay attention to like this sort of US organized crime stuff, but so many of these guys now are YouTubers or podcasts or whatever. And a lot of them were first coming out. There were some guys that you weren't sure if they were legit. A lot of them appeared not to be legit. But now you have some people like Joey Merlino, who was, the boss of a family, who now has a YouTube show and a podcast and is like, asking people to sign up for his Patreon, which I find it's a weird era we're living in, man, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff.
I know, like, whatever happened to Omerta, the code of silence. I admittedly, Goto was the first guy to really break that. I mean, there had been other Yakuza biographies, but he talked about things, including his connections to Soka Gakkai, which is a Japanese religious group that has its own political party and, a university in the United States. That was kind of like, wow. I mean, that was one reason Tokyo Vice has never been printed in Japan, because when people would read that section in the book, they were like, you can't write about these things. You can't put this in print. And I'm like, well, it's the truth. Why wouldn't you be able to put it in print?
So Soko Gakkai, I had looked into it, just personal stuff. A neighbor of mine, he moved away years ago, but he got really into it. I would hear chanting coming from his apartment, at all hours of the day. He would have people over there. So he got super into it. And he was always asking me to go with him. So I went once just to check it out and learn the chanting and do all that stuff. And it seemed relatively harmless when I was looking into it, but definitely weird. So I looked it up, and I had no idea they had all this sort of, power and I don't even know what you would call it in Japan. I was trying to figure out if it was
Well,
a cult
they,
or
they
like
have
whatever it was.
they have political power and influence. Ikeda Daisaku, the founder, well, not the founder of the group, the last leader of the group for many years, who kind of disappeared in 2011, and wasn't seen for like, I don't know, 13 years. I mean, no one saw him outside of the cult for 13 years. And you were like, is he alive or dead? At one point in his career, he made it, it's very evident that he and his group were using Goto's group, and the Yamaguchi Gumi to crush dissent, to deal with critics, and of course they're paying for violence, and that is very well documented. Actually, I think 2 years ago or a year ago, I wrote this article for Unseen Japan called "Where in the World is Ikeda Daisaku?" Because here's this religious group, and the leader hasn't been seen in public for 13 years. And I wrote a very, very long article about his group and the scandals that were involved in his relationship to organized crime. And I could not get any answer from the organization about my questions, except a couple hours before he died, or before they announced that he had died. They finally sent me a reply, which made me feel like, okay, I was a couple months off, but at least I was on the right track when I was writing that there's very little chance that this guy is alive and sentient.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a podcast to me. It's a shame that the mystery's already been revealed, though I guess no one here knows anything about it. So you could lead people on for 8 episodes and then reveal the ending.
You would have to tell people you'd have to tell me, he was the L. Ron Hubbard of Japanese religion. And even then, only a few people would get it.
I mean, it would work. I think I'd listen. All right, switching sort of gears. There's this moment in the book where you're 41 years old. You're burnt out. The nuclear disaster has just hit Japan. You get diagnosed with cancer. And as a currently burnt out 41-year-old journalist too, that really intrigued me, that moment of your life. Like, how did you move past all that? How did you keep going?
Wow. So, I was in the United States, in New York City, when there was the nuclear meltdown and tsunami and tidal wave that killed 100,000 people in Japan. Here we refer to it as 3/11, which, the equivalent of what in the U.S., whenever you say 9/11, everyone understands what you mean. In Japan, when you say 3/11, you understand what everyone means. So I just gotten back to Japan, and I brought some supplies to take to the people that needed them in Fukushima and other places. And to be honest, I gave them to some yakuza I knew, because I knew that they were actually delivering supplies directly to people there who needed them, and that seemed to be the humanitarian thing to do. But everybody is experiencing this tremendous tragedy, and then I got home. But, I don't really know anybody in that area, so it was kind of a distant thing to me. But then I got home and I opened the results of my, super physical examination, and there was like, you've got this 3.6 centimeter tumor in your liver, and it's almost definitely cancer, and we need you to come in. And I thought, wow, it's like I through dumb luck, I am not here during this horrible earthquake and nuclear disaster, but it turns out the greatest threat I have to my own life is myself. So I was pretty bummed, but, and of course this sounds really stupid, and I think I wrote about it in the book, but the first thing I did when reading through my medical report on having liver cancer, was smoke a couple clove cigarettes. I think I smoked like a pack or half a pack. Cause it's just like, well, and of course, as I'm smoking, I'm going, well, this isn't a surprise, right? I can't blame this on anyone, because here I am. I'm chain smoking these horrible cigarettes that are full of nicotine and tar, and I drink all the time, and I don't get enough sleep, and I'm living an unhealthy, stressful lifestyle. So should I be surprised that I got this? And I was like, well, I'm not going to suddenly find God and make a bargain. I'm just, it would be nice to live through this, but let's go see what's in store. But it was a kind of an awakening. It definitely made me think, I need to reevaluate what I am doing in my life. And if I do get through this, maybe just being a corporate investigator isn't the most meaningful thing I can do.
Yeah, it's also this sort of this dark irony, right? Your biggest scoop is about a Yakuza boss sneaking his way into the U.S., bribing UCLA, fooling the FBI to get a liver transplant because he had terminal liver cancer, and here you are getting diagnosed with it, maybe 5 years later, 10 years later?
Let's see. When did he get his? 2001. So maybe, since after writing about it, maybe 6 years later or something. No. 3 or 4 years later. Yeah, it was really ironic. And I did think for a second, is there a world in which I go to the Hamas and say, hey, can you hook me up with a liver man?
Yeah.
But I only thought about that for like 5 seconds. I'd rather die.
You could just shoot him a message. Maybe he shoots you one back and is like, see how it feels. It could be another element of your one-on-one interview that you get in a year or two that you can bring up.
Oh yeah, that was just like a 2011 to 2013 were like 2 years of just being pummeled by the universe, and maybe we all have to experience that, but that was a tough one.
Yeah,
and but it was interesting because so much changed in that year, because 2011 is also the year that these organized crime exclusionary ordinances went on the books in Tokyo and Okinawa, which meant that everywhere in Japan there was now a law in place that meant it was illegal to do business with the Yakuza. And if you paid them off, paid the protection money, or joined them in a business venture, then you were a criminal as well, and you could be punished. And I realized, on October 1st, 2011, when that law went into effect, when it became a national law in a sense, that was the end of the Yakuza. I was like, I have been writing about these guys and the negative effect they've had on Japan for 20 odd years, and this is the end. They may not realize it, but this is the beginning of the end for them. And that proved to be correct.
Yeah, I was going to ask, has it been the beginning of the end? Are they still kind of are they just waning their power, their influence, everything like that? Is it still on the downturn?
There was a time when the Yakuza had a say in determining who would be the next prime minister of Japan. And sometimes you could even argue which party was going to rule over the country, but they don't have that influence now. There were 80,000 Yakuza in 2011. Now that number is down to 24,000. The average age of a Yakuza is 55. I'm 55. They are a shadow of themselves. And even though, sure, some of them have gone underground, some of them have left the organizations and are doing different criminal enterprises, basically they've been decimated as a force within the country. And every year the numbers are going to keep going down. And that is, without boring your listeners, it is a combination of civil law, which makes it such an onerous penalty to do business with the Yakuza that no one wants to do it, and contract law, because in every agreement you sign in Japan now, you have to answer a question: are you a member of an organized crime group or associated with an organized crime group? And that includes checking into a hotel, getting a cell phone, setting up a bank account. And if you are, then they will deny you those services. And if you say you are not, and you are, and you sign the contract, then you get arrested for fraud and go to jail. So that has created in a short time a lot of people who are Yakuza who cannot get a cell phone, cannot rent an apartment, can't play golf, who can't take out a loan, who can't have a bank account. And it is so inconvenient that they quit. You would never think that inconvenience is how you destroy an organized crime group, but it certainly seems to be the case.
Yeah, I think about, I wonder if that sort of thing could work somewhere I mean, I don't know if the U.S. even has organized crime that's infiltrated it that much anymore. But like, could this work somewhere in Latin America, or is it just that the Yakuza were so intertwined with corporate life there and corporate structures that Japan's really sort of an anomaly? It's the only place that it could work. These sort of tactics.
I think it works in Japan is because the Yakuza, existing as semi-public organizations, right? They have their business cards. They have their office buildings. Everybody knows where they are. Until 2018, they had fan magazines. As I'm talking to you right now, I've got a stack of about, 15 Yakuza fan magazines that I need to file away because, I keep them as kind of like history, right? Since they're fading out. And when you have that sort of public presence and you're arguing that you are Robin Hoods, that you are a benevolent organization, that you are the Boy Scouts of Japan, doing humanitarian work during crises, you can't kill civilians and journalists and law enforcement. And that has made them very well behaved. I mean, it's not that they don't do it, but they do it, very rarely. And since those kind of restraints have been on them, it has been easy to sort of it has been easier than you would imagine to gently push them out into the night. In Kyushu, where the Kudokai is, now they have resisted strongly, including things like throwing grenades into the homes of opposition or blowing up hostess clubs that wouldn't pay their protection money. But that has resulted in such a crackdown that the Kudokai, which once ruled Kyushu, is down to 200 some odd people when it was once an organization of 1,000 strong. Mostly, though, Japan's sort of gentle destruction of the Yakuza, which is a blanket term for about 23 different groups, has gone amazingly well.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems like it. Like they've kind of figured it out. There's another chapter in the book that I was fascinated by because when I first heard of this, I was shocked at how much money it brings in, like completely shocked. And that's about pachinko. And, you go into this detail of how the North Koreans are funding some of these or taking some money out of this and all that. So my question for you is, I'm going to Japan for the first time in November. And should I play pachinko?
Oh, yes, you should definitely play pachinko. The National Police Agency has cleared out most of the criminal elements. There are still some pachinko parlors tied to North Korea, but increasingly less so as the Japanese, or as the Korean Japanese people who had relatives in North Korea, as the relatives die off and no new relatives go to North Korea, they're increasingly less willing to spend any money feeding or taking care of relatives back in North Korea because they're not alive anymore. So I think you could go to a pachinko parlor and play without much of a guilty conscience. My cousin Jesse Malnick came here and played pachinko and won like $700. Went to the place, played. They showed him which was the prize to cash. He went around the corner. He cashed it in for, the exchange service. He cashed in. He had $700. I was just like, I can't believe this kid. I mean, it is beginner's luck. I lucked out the first time I played pachinko, and I've never played again for except for showing someone how it was done for a report they were writing. But yeah, you should play it. It's actually fun in a sort of crazy autistic sort of way.
Yeah, no, I like flashing lights, all that, and there's nothing I love more than gambling and losing, which I'm very good at. So I'll definitely get involved. But yeah, I mean, it was, it might even be something that we do an episode on because people see North Korea all the time and they love anything about that. But it's just this story of the North Korean state basically extorting these guys who run these pachinko parlors because they've got family back in North Korea, and if they want their family to live, essentially, they need to pay some of that money back to North Korea, which I'd never heard before. It's insane.
I think for your listeners to understand it, you have to understand the background. Japan was this, I love Japan, but Japan was this monster, this imperial monster that took over lots of Asia, colonized Korea. You can watch pachinko. the series on Apple TV, and it'll tell you a lot about that. By the way, I consulted on season 2, which was fun. So they brought over all these Korean laborers to Japan as slave labor. And when the war ended, a lot of the Koreans didn't go home. Then there's the Korean War, and the Koreans who stayed in Japan basically divided along the lines of where their relatives back home were stuck. And, after North Korea and South Korea became, their own countries, basically North Korea would go to people who, had family back in North Korea and say, like, the North Koreans Association, which exists in Japan, would contact these people and say, if you don't donate to the motherland, I'm not sure your cousin or your brother or your family will survive the winter. And so for many years, they blatantly extorted money from North Korean Japanese people here. And that still continues somewhat to this day. It's pretty bizarre. But, North Korea is a criminal enterprise.
Yeah. And it just kind of blew my mind that was just happening. And there was nothing these people could do at that moment. That's about all the questions I have. I mean, is there anything else you want our listeners to know about anything you're working on right now, or about the new book that's coming out October 1st, Tokyo Noir, or anything anything at all?
I think that I didn't start to write out a trilogy, right? But Tokyo Vice, which covers my, early years in Japan and my life as a police reporter, and The Last Yakuza, which is basically a history of the Yakuza told through bosses I've met and friended over the years. And this book, Tokyo Noir, is kind of like my Tokyo Vice trilogy. You put them together, you've learned, everything I've learned of my time in Japan, and you'll learn a lot about the underworld and, and other sides of Japan that are so corrupt that they make the Yakuza look like the Boy Scouts. So I hope that people enjoy the book. There is some dark humor in there, and it doesn't have a terribly unhappy ending, which is good because I'm alive, right? So how unhappy can it be? And the other thing that might interest your listeners is this year I went back to Columbia, Missouri, my hometown, to do a podcast about an alleged serial killer at the hospital where my father worked. The podcast is called Night Shift. And to my surprise and delight, it is the number one podcast on Apple right now. So I never thought that would happen because I thought, who will be interested in this story from 1992? But so I'm very pleased to know that investigating a crime in my own hometown, one that involves my father since he started the investigation, has turned out to be something that interests people in the United States. It's great. I think my dad is really happy as well.
Yeah, I had no idea. I get like one of these pod news emails, and I was looking at it today. Podcast data for September 17th, 2024, number one in Apple Podcast, Witness Night Shift. I had no idea that was you.
That's our podcast. And the crew from The Evaporated, which was our podcast about missing people in Japan, which was also really, really fun to do. I took them with me to Missouri. So, Amy Yoshida and Shoko Yoshida, the Planbeck sisters, as we know them, we all went to Missouri to do this story. So it's an interesting time in my life to be doing the PR for this podcast and have the book coming out this month.
That's you pull the sort of Uno reverse on culture clashing, just bringing a bunch of I'm sure Tokyo residents or Japanese media people to Columbia, Missouri, sort of the reverse of what you had to go through. So I'm sure that made some interesting cultural exchanges right there.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was, you work with these, we worked for like 2 years on this podcast about missing people in Japan, and then go to the United States and have to meet my parents and be interviewing, the ex-prosecutors and nurses about this, series of 40 veterans dying at a VA hospital in 1992 and trying to determine what really happened. That was surreal, but also very lovely.
Did you take them to a Waffle House?
Oh my God. The very first night we got into St. Louis, I picked a Waffle House right next to, I picked the hotel right next to a Waffle House, the Residence Inn. It's across from this really seedy adult goods
I've been
store
there.
and the Waffle House.
I've been there when I covered Ferguson. I think we stayed right near the airport, and I'm pretty sure I went to a Waffle House, and it's got to be that Waffle House.
Oh, yeah.
It's got to be that. It's got to be that one.
Do you know my father was involved as the medical examiner in that case peripherally as well. He's still the medical examiner for Boone County. So yeah, that Waffle House is great. By the way, they're not open 24 hours a day now. They close at midnight, and you can get takeout up until 5 a.m. After midnight, they're closed, which was quite a disappointment for us.
It's probably for the safety of the employees, knowing Waffle House and that area. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Jake Adelstein. If you guys want to get his 3 books, you definitely should. The Last Yakuza is, more than you'll ever want to know about the Yakuza. Tokyo Vice is fantastic. And his new book, Tokyo Noir, comes out October 1st. You can get it anywhere. And then I just learned through the course of making this podcast, this interview right now, Night Shift, #1 podcast on Apple Podcasts in the country. If you want to get into a serial killer story, which I think most Americans do. But Jake, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for having me on.